Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening wherever you're tuning in from this afternoon. And welcome to the Oxford Society's Twitter panel on decarbonising Kazakhstan. Now, for anyone who listened live, there was some technical glitches, but through the magic of editing, we've been able to go through and fix some of those issues. For now, though, I'm thrilled to introduce our panel for this evening. We have three fantastic guests, all going through the challenges currently facing Kazakhstan and the road ahead for decarbonisation. So, joining me on the panel this evening are Maximilian Hess, who is a Central Asia Fellow at the Eurasia Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the founder of the London-based political risk firm Madina Advisory. He's also the author of the fantastic book Economic War, Ukraine and the Global Conflict Between Russia and the West. Also joining us today is Vilda Alejandro Sanchez, who is the president of Second Floor Strategies, a consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. He's a freelance writer for defense news agencies, including Breaking Defense, Janes, and Shepherd Media, specializing in Latin America and Central Asia. And also joining us today is Madina Junussova, who's a senior research fellow at the Institute of Public Policy and Administration and an urban development lead for GSD. She also has 20 years of academic research experience in urban and regional planning and policy analysis. As well as in 2017, she contributed, as well as back in 2017, when she contributed to the OECD's Urban Policy Review on Kazakhstan. So, Max, I'm going to throw this first question to you. Kazakhstan obviously has a very energy-intensive grid at the moment. The majority of Kazakhstan's energy is still produced by coal. So with that grid is what we're starting with, what do you think the biggest challenges will be for Kazakhstan to actually achieve decarbonisation without completely destroying the economy?
Well, thank you for having us. And, certainly I think the number one challenge that Kazakhstan has is finding a long-term shift away from its hydrocarbon and mining-dependent economy and providing the right and finding and developing the right kind of financing structures for that. My recent report for Oxford Society looked at one particular example of this, but the lion's share of Kazakh financing, whether that be international financing or particularly the state, where you have these state holding companies, almost sovereign wealth fund giants, Samruk-Kazyna and Baytarek, are really primarily structured around providing support for Kazakhstan's legacy sectors, oil, gas, and the mining. Now, Kazakhstan needs those to continue to fund its growth and continue to be able to invest in these kind of projects going forward. But Kazakhstan, like so many other places, faces the fundamental question of if financing is going to be more expensive for green projects, especially those that have a longer runtime or whose potential energy costs won't be as low as gas energy production, or even in some cases in the region, coal energy production in the initial years, then they really need state support to get those financing costs down. A lot of it has to do also with the breakdown of the Central Asia power systems. This is the legacy power system in the region dating back to the construction of one unified grid under the Soviet Union, which has really collapsed in recent years. And domestic energy demand has been growing in the region, particularly in Uzbekistan, but in Kazakhstan as well in recent years, in large part, although not solely, due to crypto mining, which I certainly would say is not a economic ideal use, at least for the residents of Kazakhstan and for the government, perhaps for some individual interests and crypto miners it is, but is not really the ideal use. So you've had this significant increase in domestic energy demand, and at the same time, a breakdown of the ability to import electricity from other Central Asian countries when there are different spikes. And the sort of output and demand picture in Central Asian countries is very different, in large part due to the hydropower resources in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan in particular, that Kazakhstan at least used to import more electricity from, and for which, at least for Tajikistan, is a significant part of its export and development strategy going forward. Of course, whether hydroelectric dams are entirely the most green project in this region is a whole other question, given we know the legacy of the Amudarya River that once fed the Aral Sea and decreased water flows in the Sirdarya. And these are political issues in the region as well. But there is also substantial coal, and the coal plants exist. And to meet that additional electricity demand, you have to go to what is available and what can be shifted on relatively quickly. While there has been some growth, and the government does have its own green agenda, it has been advancing that for wind power in particular, but also some solar power. The time that it takes to get those assets online is far longer. And that goes back to my point earlier around the financing costs as well, right? Ensuring that those finance costs are low and competitive, and arguably even better than the cost of restarting some of these coal projects or investing further there is crucially important.
So, Wilder, I'll throw this question to you. We have seen Kazakhstan make some efforts to want to move towards a greener economy and a greener power grid. But in recent years, we've also seen the usage of coal go up in the country, as well as natural gas having gone up as well. Why have we seen this reversion with the extra use of coal, even though that the Kazakh leadership has stated that it wants to move towards decarbonisation? So, Wilder, I'm going to throw this question to you. Now, Kazakhstan has stated their goal is to hit 15% of the power grid being powered by renewables by the year 2030. Although there's now been some speculation after Kazakhstan's leadership appeared in Azerbaijan over the last few days that the leadership may look to try and bring that target forward to 2029 before the COP summit in Baku, just over the Caspian Sea from Kazakhstan. So how likely do you think it is that Kazakhstan will be able to meet those targets by 2029? And what position do you think Kazakhstan will be in by the time we hit that COP summit?
Yes, I do believe that Kazakhstan can reach its goal of 15% of the grid being powered by renewable energy by 2030. Yes, also COP29 is going to take place this year in neighboring Azerbaijan, which is great because hopefully the fact that a Caucasus country, a Caspian country, is going to host a COP meeting means that the Caucasus and Central Asia will have a bigger voice and a bigger say when it comes to the climate change and water security and green energy and all these other issues that are very relevant today, but we don't really talk enough about how they affect Central Asia and the Caucasus. At the same time, I am going to be reluctant to say that this goal can be reached before this goal of 15% by 2030 can be reached beforehand. I don't know. I don't think that's possible. I know that Astana has been trying to obtain more green investments. They have agencies like the Astana International Financial Fund. The Astana International Financial Center with a green finance center. They have agencies like Kazakh Invest, which are trying to bring green financing, green investment, and green energy projects to the country, but they have had very limited success. The one exception is the Sanatas wind farm, but that's still only one project. There's another thing that there plans to develop maybe solar farms as well, but they're still in the developing stages, from what I understand. So I don't think that this goal of 15% by 2030 can be reached before 2030.
So, Max, one of the concerns that we currently have is that getting rid of these subsidies may cause some level of domestic unrest in the country. As, if people remember, it was the removal of subsidies on LPG that was the catalyst for the uprisings in 2022. That was the catalyst for the riots in 2022. So I can more than understand why some of these governments might be hesitant to roll back subsidies, even if it does help them divulge themselves away from the oil and gas industry. So, Max, do you think this is a concern that the current Kazakh leadership has, and it might end up serving as a barrier to decarbonisation? Or
certainly, I think the government is trying to be somewhat more responsive to some potential public disquiet concerns around fuel, gasoline prices in particular. I would say, the primary issue for Kazakhstan and its, standalone green footprint is not its domestic fuel consumption, but its role as a major international fuel exporter and exporter of other hydrocarbons. Kazakhstan has, taken some efforts to try to move up the value chain, producing more petrochemicals, something else we see in the region. But I think certainly the Kazakh government's response would be, and the response of most Kazakhs would be, for driving the development of our economy, investment in these sectors and continued marketing of Kazakhstan's hydrocarbon production is necessary. And I certainly wouldn't begrudge them that either. I would say, it's about how do you reinvest the returns therefrom. So, even if Kazakhstan does take actions, which I think would primarily be driven more by budgetary concerns domestically around further fuel subsidies, that's not going to be the key change in its green outlook. It's really about getting the state lined up and international institutions lined up behind developing new green power sources. And if one goes to Kazakhstan has its lovely Museum of the Future there. They talk a lot about their own green agenda, their plans to do this, and their desire to build out more renewable energy resources. It's not that I'm skeptical about Kazakhstan's commitment there too. It's again around finding the right ways to keep that cost.
So Madina, thanks for joining us. Now, you put out an absolutely fantastic report called Decarbonizing Kazakhstan: What Future Awaits Mining Regions and Towns. And I want to unpack one of the parts of this report with you. Now, as part of that report, it goes through how Kazakhstan will be affected by a slow transition and a fast transition into decarbonisation, and what effects it's likely to have on the economy, and what effects it's likely to have either way on the economy and wider society. So can you start us off by taking us through some of the issues that we'd likely face with this, as well as the challenges that are likely to pop up with either?
I think it's interesting because this was the reason. I mean, in Kazakhstan, there is no solid energy strategy or energy transition strategy, or any strategy, long-term strategy about the energy sector development. And that's why we decided to do a kind of this modeling of future scenarios and try to understand what is the opinion of key experts and stakeholders about the possible futures. And yet, you are right, we've had these several options. And of course, if there will be extreme option, and we took this option because this national company actually holding most of the assets in the energy sector, they wrote that they're going to implement this decarbonization extremely fast. And that's why we saw that it's possible. But in this case, of course, there will be regional inequalities and social segregation, and there will be job losses, and the mining regions in town will have some social tensions. And of course, it will be a really sensitive version.
So Alejandro, I'm going to throw this question to you. There are a lot of ways that decarbonization can be approached, ranging from lowering the amount of energy that's produced all the way through to reforming how much energy is demanded by the general public in Kazakhstan, with some suggesting that one of the best ways to actually make Kazakhstan more energy efficient would be to focus on the demand side. This being done through things like improving infrastructure, as quite a lot of the infrastructure in Kazakhstan, particularly in the power grids, is quite old or even Soviet-era infrastructure, which loses quite a lot of efficiency in the transmission as well as in the actual distribution lines. So looking at this as an option, do you think it is something that could be done as a different approach to lowering the amount of carbon emissions used by Kazakhstan without having to reduce the amount of oil or exports?
Because of the war in Ukraine, because of the tensions between the United States and Europe with Russia, demand for Central Asian energy and hydrocarbons, so if they're from Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, or really not the Caucasus countries like Azerbaijan, it's not going to go anytime soon. So Kazakhstan is in a tricky situation, in a complicated situation via which it wants to diversify its economy, it wants to decarbonize its economy and industries, but at the same time, there's a lot of profit to be made. So there's a balance that Kazakhstan is going to have to figure out how they can achieve both and go both objectives almost simultaneously. I will say that just recently, very recently, I believe it was actually in mid-March, President Tokayev went to Baku. He met with the Azerbaijani president, and they signed a number of memorandums. And there are two that I really want to mention. One is an agreement on the gradual increase in the volume of transit of Kazakh oil through the territory of Azerbaijan via JSC national company Kazmunia Gas and Azerbaijan Sokar. The second is a memorandum of strategic cooperation in the field of purchase and sale of Kazakh oil between JSC national company Kaz. This suggests that while Kazakhstan again wants to decarbonize its economy, diversify the areas from where energy can be produced domestically, they want to continue exporting hydrocarbons. They plan to continue exporting oil. So I think I don't know how they can somehow reconcile both objectives and somehow reach their decarbonization goals while at the same time increasing or at the very least maintaining the levels of oil exports that they are carrying out right now. So going back, so that will be the first part of my answer. The second part will simply be that what do you think is the most likely strategy going forward? I think they just can continue doing what they're doing. Obviously, when it comes to obviously the best answer will be simply to develop more renewable energy centers and around the country. Kazakhstan is a really large country. It's probably one of the 15 more largest countries in the world, maybe like in top 10 really, and they are also one of at the same time, it's very sparsely populated. The population is around like 19 to 20 million. It's growing, but not really growing that fast. So in that sense, they have the space to develop wind farms, to develop solar farms to address the population's requirements, and maybe even like have enough made energy produced by renewable energies that they can even export it. But that's getting a little bit too ambitious. I will finally say that Kazakhstan remains committed to the development of green energies. Just this year, there were two high-level meetings that I want to talk about. The first one has to do with Qatar. President Tokayev received the chairman of the board of directors of Nebras Power, and they discussed how Nebras Power can invest in Kazakhstan's renewable energy sector. Also in March, the Minister of Energy of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia also went to Kazakhstan. He met with President Tokayev, and they also discussed energy and how they discussed a joint investment project for the construction of a 1 gigabyte wind power plant in the Setsui region, and as well as plans for interaction of Kazakhstan in the field of green energy. So to summarize, yes, Kazakhstan plans to will continue relying on its hydrocarbon, its oil and natural gas industries, but at the same time, they're going to try to continue trying to receive or procure or secure green investment, green energy related contracts with some of their neighbors, particularly countries in the Arab Gulf.
So Max, Wilder mentioned back there the Zanatas wind farm project, which is a really interesting microcosm of all the issues currently going on in Kazakhstan at the moment, and one you actually wrote an absolutely fantastic report on, with the title of that report being Zanatas, a test case for international financing in Kazakhstan's green development. And this is obviously a very interesting issue for both the power and decarbonization process within Kazakhstan, but it's also really interesting as a test case for what international funding and cross-border cooperation can do, with the funding that actually backed this project coming from a few interesting, with the funding to back this project actually coming from a number of fairly interesting sources. So I don't want to spoil too much, and I won't spoil too much for anyone who hasn't read the report yet, but can you take us through how that project was funded and why it might serve as a test case for future projects like it that will help Kazakhstan reach this transition phase?
Certainly. The project has a number of funders, including some private market ones, but the key players are international development finance institutions that are traditionally not seen to cooperate with one another. So on the Western side, you have the EBRD, and on the so-called Chinese side, you have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is one of the development banks that is typically associated with the Belt and Road project. Now, what this means when these kind of development finance institutions provide loans is they provide them on relatively concessional terms. The headline price that one gets for borrowing from these institutions is cheaper than if one were to borrow direct on the capital markets or in a private project finance structure. This is a very typical tool of financing green development all over the world, but it is very, very rare that a Chinese development finance institution, Chinese and development finance institutions seen so closely Western, would cooperate with one another. Zanatas, at the time of its construction, is Kazakhstan's largest wind farm, and as sort of briefly touched on earlier, is particularly important because it's also replacing the industry for one of Kazakhstan's so-called mono towns, old Soviet legacy cities that were built around one industry. That was what was particularly notable for me because I actually see this as an area of potential future cooperation. It is both in China's interest and the West's interest for green reasons and in Kazakhstan's interest to finance these kind of projects. It's in their interest for other questions, including for China in the long run to continue extracting gas from Central Asia, which is one of its key suppliers. for me, it's a real question about whether there can be more cooperation on these kind of projects going forward in an area where I think all parties could potentially benefit. And it's also worth stressing one of the flags for this project from sort of the Western provider's point of view is also that it was supplied with Chinese manufactured wind turbines. That is a key point of sort of geoeconomic competition between the West and China right now, and you'll get a lot of complaints in Europe and in U.S. Congress about how China subsidizes the construction of those similar to solar panels and therefore can sell them at much cheaper prices, whereas the Western wind turbine manufacturers, Siemens Gamesa is perhaps the best known one, have faced a lot of real financial difficulties of late. For Kazakhstan, I think it naturally makes sense to buy the Chinese ones, given the closeness of the project as well as the Chinese financing here. Although some Kazakh wind projects have also purchased Siemens and other Western manufactured wind turbines. But my sort of concern in one of the areas is that I wanted to flag is I actually think depending on there has a lot of monitoring that still needs to be done. Local perspectives still need to be taken into account. And a researcher in Germany, Beryl Ochkali, she has been doing some field work in Kazakhstan and in Janata. So I look forward to her analysis of the local impacts and the local perception as well. But for me, I think more of this kind of financing is exactly what does need to happen to speed up Kazakhstan's green transition and to get buy-in. The reality is, however, China-Western relations will not be shaped primarily by the green agenda in Kazakhstan, and I fear that this project may be a test case that we do not see too much follow-up on.
So, Madina, one of the points Max mentioned there was about the local opinions and how this is likely to affect different parts of the country. Now, in the report you put out, you mentioned that there is a concern that by putting these measures in to try and decarbonize the economy, that there is a risk of increasing inequality between people living in the west of the country and people who may be living in the south of the country, as these measures are likely to hurt more jobs in industries that are out west and in the resource intense parts of the country. With the report then going on to mention that, frankly, the government has a lot of work to be done in order to get the population on board with these reforms. So can you take us through some of the worries about inequality that might stem from these decarbonisation programs and how the government plans to work with the people to either educate them or to support them to get through this transition period?
I think this is very important because without capacity change and mindset change, we cannot reach anything. And I just mentioned, for example, we'll do a lot of increasing the demand side, but we do not, or increasing the supply side of energy, but we don't do a lot on demand side energy and increasing the energy efficiency. So if we look at the institutions, and I was supporting to transferring the knowledge on energy transition course, which is free online for the Central Asian countries. But if you look, there are like few people sign up because I think there is not enough done for the public awareness and the awareness of the institutions like educational institutions and even the national government, the local government, and all other stakeholders about this importance of energy transition. So the communication, I think, and the lack of dialogue between different stakeholders. So mining companies, they do have their own decarbonization strategies, and they are not aligned at all with the national strategy. And the national government is not trying to help these mining companies with implementation of their strategies, because I don't see much on, for example, the digitalization or making these industries safer and more attractive for young people to join. And this alternative energy or renewable energy sector is dominated by the foreign, I would say, experts. And I don't see that the locals are really finding job places there. So there should be a really much more done and invested in the capacity building change. And it's not yet there.
So I'm going to throw to Alejandro on this one. Now, part of the articles and the work you put together on this issue regularly brought up the big problem in this region of water and the growing water insecurity found within this region, even stating that the areas that are likely to be hurt hardest economically by these decarbonisation efforts are also the same areas that are likely to face water insecurity going forward as well, particularly in the west and south of Kazakhstan, particularly in the west and north of Kazakhstan, particularly in the west particularly areas like the west of Kazakhstan and the west of Uzbekistan. So how do you think Kazakhstan will try and solve these water problems going forward? And frankly, can they actually decarbonize fast enough or move to a point where the major impacts of this water insecurity aren't going to have detrimental effects on the wider population?
This is a great question. Water security is something that I'm very passionate about. And when it comes to Kazakhstan, water security has to do a lot. It's not an issue it's an issue that's linked with Kazakhstan's foreign policy. What do I mean by that? When it comes to Kazakhstan, water security is one of their major issues that they're going to have to tackle, that they have to tackle right today, not just tomorrow. And what do we mean by this? When we look at a map, Kazakhstan's major water sources are the future of Kazakhstan's major water sources have to do with foreign relations, with Kazakhstan's foreign policy, and relations with its neighbors. Let's look at a map. We know about Kazakhstan, they share the RLC with Uzbekistan, where the RLC, which really actually resembles a group of lakes nowadays, where it can be healed or not, will depend greatly on cooperation between Kazakhstan and between Astana and Tashkent. Then we look at Lake Baikal, which is fed by the Ili River, which is born in China. Now we know that China is building dams and irrigation projects in Xinjiang, and that is affecting the water levels the water flow that's reaching Lake Baikal. There's already some scientific research that shows that the water levels of Lake Baikal are going down. That's problematic. Then we look at the north, at the Ural River. The Ural River is born in Russia. By the time the waters reach Kazakhstan, they're heavily polluted. Kazakhstan and Russia have created a joint commission to work together to clean the water of the Ural, and there have been some successes, which is something that I'm very optimistic about. Finally, when it comes to the Caspian Sea, this body of water is shared by 5 countries: Kazakhstan, Russia, Azerbaijan, Iran, and Turkmenistan. There is even a declaration, there's even a treaty that is meant to protect the Caspian Sea, called the Declaration of Tehran, or no, I'm sorry, the Convention of Tehran, the Tehran Convention, which was signed, I believe, in 2003. However, it hasn't been properly applied. We know that there's pollution, overfishing, and there are also the water levels of the Caspian Sea are decreasing. So when it comes to Kazakhstan, the future of Kazakhstan's industry, energy, mining, agriculture, and even just water for the Kazakhstani population, Kazakhstan is going to have to address these issues by interacting with its neighbors. And something that I have done research a lot, and something that I have argued, is that Kazakhstan's famous multi-vector foreign policy has to evolve into what I'm calling a multi-vector foreign policy 2.0, which has a stronger green component. Let's call it a green multi-vectorism. By that, I mean that Kazakhstan is going to have to engage its neighbors and remind them that cooperation when it comes to environmental issues is necessary, especially water security, and that's going to have otherwise, Kazakhstan is going to suffer a lot in the coming years. President Tokayev gave a speech in September 1st of last year, I believe, where he mentioned that if water security, water usage doesn't change, there are going to be shortages by 2030, droughts by 2050. He reformed the water sector in Kazakhstan. He created a Ministry of Water and Irrigation, which shows that at least at the executive level, the president is very much aware that water is going to be a challenge for his country if the situation doesn't change, if current policies don't change.
So I'm going to move to Max here because I know Max has to disappear in a few minutes. So what do you think will be the biggest hurdle for Kazakhstan to actually achieve these decarbonization or green energy goals? Do you think the issues are going to be purely economic, or is it likely political issues that will need to be solved as well?
Stated earlier, the financing costs for me really are the key one that needs to be overcome. The sort of test case that I examined in Junussova is one potential way of doing that, but as mentioned, I think geopolitical issues are going to get involved there. Certainly Kazakhstan or the West individually can provide lots of cheap financing for this kind of green development without cooperating with one another, but I certainly think that in these cases it does make sense for cooperation. But as stated, the Central Asian tail won't wag the dog of Chinese, U.S. in particular, but broadly Chinese-Western bilateral relations. For Kazakhstan, domestically, as stated, the government has put forward an agenda. They have stated they are committed, but the reality is, in particular, when you do have this kind of international involvement, which I don't want to say is by all means perfect, is that the ability of the local players to extract rents becomes complicated. You have ESG reporting standards. You have the need for disclosure for tendering for some parts of these projects, often a key requirement of this kind of international financing. So, the government showing that it's committed there, whereas a lot of the traditional oil and gas projects, as well as the power projects, have rent-seeking networks attached to them, is a real difficulty. And Kazakhstan needs to put its own money where its mouth is, and the reality is, because it has its own quasi-sovereign wealth fund in Samruk-Kazyna and does have its own ability to provide support for these, I think by going and showing that the Kazakh government itself is willing to put its own direct money into these projects, and essentially transferring money from its oil and gas receipts to the green agenda, will be a key step.
So, Max, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on this one. Thanks for jumping on. And for now, I'm going to throw to Madina. Madina, if I was to give you all the power in the world to help Kazakhstan make this transition, that you could do absolutely anything you wanted, what policy do you think you'd pursue? And what policy do you think you'd actually pursue? What policy do you think you'd pursue? And how likely is it, do you think the government would actually go down that same road?
So first thing, we actually really want to have a clear strategy of decentralization, because the president and the government talk a lot about this, but it's not clear how it will benefit regions and towns. And also we think that regional policy is outdated. It should be actually updated based on this new decarbonization stream. And also, as I said, there is no single energy strategy of what is going to be like a long-term vision in the energy sector. And this all together should be coherent. It should not be a pure sectoral type of approach. It should be considering the social justice and the elements of, the new economy. So the green economy strategies that we have, it also should be revised, considering this regional policy, decentralization, and how we can empower the local levels, and how we can propose alternative future to the mining regions. And if we can give them chance to make these visions and future themselves. So it's and also there is no dialogue between stakeholders, because there is no clear policy on the public and private sector debate and the public and community relationship. So probably also this public administration reform, emphasizing this dialogue with the local stakeholders, and emphasizing this dialogue with mining companies, so that they can be responsible and also participate in this planning of the future alternative strategies. So actually, there are a lot of things should be done, and also in the planning field, because I'm from the planning field. In urban planning, legislation and the policies should be changed to allow the town planning located on the lowest level of the subnational government really have some fiscal and decision-making power, so that they can actually do something with their future. Right now, they're really binded and they're constrained. They don't have any options to go.
Lastly, I'll throw to Wilder to finish this all off. Wilder, can you give us a 60-second answer, effectively going through what you think will be the biggest hurdles going forward for Kazakhstan to actually achieve decarbonisation and the green economy that it's been chasing?
I think the first one is simply that Kazakhstan has not been able to secure investments in its green energy field. As I mentioned before, you have agencies like AIFC, Kazakhstan Invest as well, which are tasked with trying to bring investments. AIFC even has a green finance center to try to specifically focus on green investment which includes green energy, but haven't been successful yet. I am hopeful because there are agreements with UAE, Qatari, and even Saudi companies and the respective governments. So I am hopeful that investment in green energy will come from these countries, since Kazakhstan has not been able to procure them from other countries. I think that will be the biggest hurdle going forward. And the second biggest hurdle is that water security. Again, mining, all these energy industries, that are all water-intensive industries to one degree or another, and Kazakhstan does not have that much water to spare or to waste. So Kazakhstan needs to carry out a massive restructuring of its water strategies going forward, water policies going forward, what can be used for what kind of industries and initiatives in water and for population usage. So that's going to be the second hurdle. And finally, the third hurdle will simply be greater integration and cooperation, because Kazakhstan is not alone in this problem. It's not alone when it comes to this problem of decarbonizing its economy. All the Central Asian countries are in the same situation. Unfortunately, while we have seen more cooperation, certainly more dialogue between the 5 Central Asian presidents and foreign affairs ministers in the past 5 and 6 years, which is something that I'm very happy about. There's still no Central Asian Union. They attempted to do something like that 30 years ago. It didn't really work. So greater connectivity, greater cooperation, maybe even greater energy sharing between the five Central Asian nations is going to be necessary going forward, so that all 5 Central Asian nations can decarbonize their economy in the near future, so they can be better protected, so their industries can be better protected, so their energy grids can be better protected, so their populations can receive more energy, the energy that they deserve, so they can have a good life. So I think that will be the third biggest hurdle.
So it's been an absolute pleasure to be hosting this one tonight, even though the Twitter app may not have been as helpful as we hoped. But again, I still think it's well worth the chat. As frankly, all our panelists tonight have given some great insights onto Kazakhstan and how it's looking at decarbonizing the economy, as well as what it will likely take to achieve this goal. And obviously, there's a lot to unpack on that one. But for now, I want to give a massive thanks to tonight's guests, Max Hess, Alejandro Sanchez, and Madina, who've all been absolutely fantastic to jump on this one. And I do highly recommend you go check out those 2 reports that Ox has posted up, as well as go check out some of the work that Wild has put out in the past. As speaking as someone who's read those reports multiple times, they are absolutely full of amazing insights into this particular issue. Again, highly recommend you give them a read. But for now, thank you for listening to the panel, thank you for listening to our guests tonight, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you at another Oxus panel sometime in the near future.